The sketch had been on the bench since before dawn. A single piston, a single stroke, the same problem he had been turning over since the night Mokjae coaxed the first push out of the cylinder, and they had all stood there watching it stop. Do-jin set the charcoal down and looked at the cold engine. "One push, you've given me," he said, not quite to himself, not quite to the machine. "Now I need you to do it 10,000 times an hour and never ask me to help. Admit the steam, push, let it go, come back, do it again, on your own. That's the whole game. That's the difference between a curiosity and a civilization that never has to get tired." The engine said nothing. It sat on its mounts in the gray pre-fire light and waited, as machines do, for someone to solve the problem it could not solve for itself. The problem was the return. A single stroke was a trick. What he needed was a cycle, something that breathed in and breathed out without being told to, that turned its own exhaust into its next inhalation, that carried the memory of each push into the setup for the next. He had known the shape of the answer for weeks. The difficulty, as always, was cutting it out of real metal in a real world where the tolerances had to be held by hand. Mokjae had been the one to cut it. He brought the slide valve to the bench 3 mornings later and set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man who had not slept and did not want anyone to know it. The valve was a flat-faced block of close-fitted brass, ground to slide in a ported chest with barely a whisper of clearance. Cha-young's grinding crew had seen to that. Mokja ran a thumb along its face and then looked up. "Watch," he said. "The piston goes down, but as it goes it drags this valve across, and the valve cuts the steam off this side and opens it to the other side, so now the steam pushes it back up." He moved his hands through the motion, the valve sliding on its rod in the air between them. "It works its own breathing off its own motion." He was grinning in the way he only grinned when a piece of mechanism had surprised him. "I didn't invent it, teacher. You pointed at where it had to be. But it's the cleverest dead simple thing I ever cut. A machine that remembers to breathe by the act of breathing." Do-jin turned the valve over in his hands. The ports were clean. The face was flat enough that oil spread across it in a thin, unbroken film. He set it back down without saying anything, which Mokjae had learned to read as the highest available praise. The flywheel came from Tae-ho. It had been cast in a single pour. Tae-ho had refused to attempt it any other way, had argued the point with himself aloud for 2 days before committing to the mold, and the rim had come out without a seam worth measuring. Cho-young's people had then spent the better part of a week at the grinding frame, truing the rim to a tolerance that would not shake the mounts apart at running speed. The result was a disc of iron that sat on its shaft with a solidity that felt almost geological, as though it had always been there, and the shaft had grown up through it. Tae-ho rested a hand on the rim the morning they fitted it to the crank. 1 pour, no seam, and Cho-young's people ground the rim true so it won't shake itself off the mounts at speed. He patted it once, the way a man pats a horse he trusts. "This is the part one understand in my bones, Do-jin. It's just weight and patience. The piston does the shouting. The wheel does the remembering. It keeps turning through the quiet parts so the loud parts have somewhere to push to." He was quiet for a moment, watching the rim catch the lamplight. "Like a good crew that. Somebody steady carrying you through the dead spots. The dead points, top and bottom of the stroke, where the crank had no mechanical advantage and the piston was momentarily pushing against nothing useful, had been the other half of the problem. The flywheel solved them the only honest way, by storing the energy of the power stroke as angular momentum and spending it through the dead arc, so the crank never had to stop and think about whether to continue. It was not clever, it was patient. It was exactly the kind of solution Do-jin had come to trust most. They fired the boiler at mid-morning. The pressure climbed slowly, the way it always did, and then the needle reached the mark Seo-rin had scratched on the gauge face, and Do-jin opened the steam cock, and the slide valve began to move, and the flywheel began to turn, and the whole assembly began, without anyone's hands on it, without anyone pushing or pulling or coaxing, to run. Mokjae had been watching the valve chest. When he realized no one was touching anything, he stepped back, and then stepped back again, and his voice came out slightly higher than usual. We're not touching it. Nobody's touching it, and it won't stop. It just keeps going. It keeps going. Chol-young was standing at the far side of the flywheel, with both hands pressed over her mouth. When she finally took them away, she was laughing, but her eyes were wet. It doesn't get tired. Look at it. It doesn't get tired. The ox gets tired. My hands get tired. The river dries up. This thing would run till the fire goes out and not know it had been working at all. We made a thing that doesn't get tired. Do-jin watched the flywheel turn and said nothing. He had known it would work. He had done the arithmetic. He had checked the fits. He had run the logic forward until the conclusion was unavoidable. Knowing it would work and watching it work were not the same experience, and he allowed himself the 30 seconds it took to understand the difference before he went back to watching the instruments. Seo-rin was at the speed counter. She had been watching it since the first revolution, and now she turned from it with an expression that was not celebration. It's gaining, it's past any safe speed, and still climbing, Do-jin. It doesn't know to stop. He was already at the valve. He got his hand around the steam cock and choked it back, and the engine slowed, and the counter needle dropped, and he held the valve where it was and looked at the rest of them. Because it can't. The words came out harder than he intended. It'll take every scrap of fire we give it and spin till it flies apart. A man minding the valve every second isn't an engine. It's a new kind of slavery. It needs to govern itself. It needs to feel its own speed and pull its own reins, or it's too dangerous to ever leave running. He released the valve, and the engine climbed again, and he caught it again, and they all stood there watching him do by hand what a mechanism needed to do on its own, and the point was made without further argument. The governor had been Pyo-eun's problem to understand, and his problem to specify, and Mukjae's problem to cut. The principle was old. Do-jin had sketched it from memory. 2 weighted balls on hinged arms, mounted on a spindle geared to the crankshaft, so that as the engine sped up, the balls swung outward by centrifugal force, and their outward swing, through a collar and a linkage, closed the steam valve, and as the engine slowed, the balls dropped, and the valve opened again, a loop. The error feeding the correction that erased the error. Byo-in-ha had not been present for the first run. She arrived the morning the governor was fitted, stood at the edge of the machine floor with her notebook already open, and watched the first governed startup with the expression of someone watching a mathematical proof walk across a room under its own power. It corrects itself. Her voice was barely above a murmur. Her finger traced a circle in the air, the loop, the feedback, the closed path from output back to input. Too fast lifts the balls cut the steam. The cut slows it. Slowing drops the balls. The drop feeds the steam. Round and round. The error feeding the fix that erases the error. It is a loop, Do-jin. A loop made of brass and spinning weight. She was not quite shouting. She was the kind of person who became very still when something moved her deeply, and she was very still. I have written this shape in mathematics 100 times and never once thought you could forge it. You have built a thing that holds its own judgment. That is the nearest thing to a thinking I have ever seen that wasn't alive. The engine ran. The balls rose and fell in their small arcs. The needle on the speed counter held within a range that Seo-rin had marked in red ink on either side of the working mark, and it did not leave that range, and no one touched the valve. Chol-young had been watching the governor for a long time before she spoke. It's minding itself, she said softly. We're feeding it more fire, and it's just saying no, taking what it needs and no more. A week ago, a man would have called that a spirit in the machine. No spirit, Do-jin said. Just a loop. It feels its speed and answers it. That's the whole secret, and it's better than a spirit, because you can build another one tomorrow, and it'll behave exactly the same. We didn't put a soul in it. We put a judgment in it, and we can write that judgment down and give it away like everything else here. He meant it as a practical statement. He could see from Pyo's face that she was filing it somewhere deeper than practical. They belted the engine to the works that afternoon, a flat leather belt running from the flywheel shaft to the main line shaft overhead, and from the line shaft down to the hammer, the grinding frame, the boring mill. Tae-ho was the one who opened the clutch and let the belt take the load, and he stood watching the hammer rise and fall under firepower on a day when the stream outside was running low, and his expression was the expression of a man revising a belief he had held for 20 years. The hammer's running and the river's barely moving out there. 20 years that forge could only work as hard as the water let it. Dry season, you waited. Froze up, you waited. Now the works decides when it works, not the river. He turned from the hammer to Do-jin. Do-jin, we just cut ourselves loose from the one thing we could never argue with. We can build a works anywhere now, even where there's no water at all. Anywhere. The words sat in the room alongside the chuffing of the engine and the rhythm of the hammer, and meant more than it said. Do-jin stood at the center of the floor and watched the belt turn and the hammer fall, and the governor balls trace their small patient arcs, and thought about what the three properties actually added up to. Tireless, it did not need relief, did not need sleep, did not slow in the heat or stiffen in the cold. Self-governing, it did not need a minder at the valve, did not need a man whose whole working life was spent watching a needle. And now, Tae-ho's word, placeless, fuel and water were all it asked. Not a river, not a gradient, not a location that some magistrate or some accident of geography had chosen for you. Tireless, he said, not quite to the others. Minds itself, goes anywhere. He watched the flywheel turn. You're not just power, are you? You're the thing that lets us stop huddling. First a works that can stand anywhere, then something that can move. He caught himself. One thing at a time, Do-jin. One honest thing at a time. The crew began to disperse toward the end of the afternoon. Mok-jae to clean the valve chest, Cho-young to log the bearing temperatures, Tae-ho to bank the forge. The engine kept running. The needle held. The balls rose and fell. Seo-rin did not move from the boiler end of the machine. She had her notebook open, but she was not writing in it. She was looking at the boiler itself, the riveted iron drum that sat at the heart of everything, that held the pressure that drove the piston, that turned the crank, that spun the flywheel, that ran the works. It was not the most visible part of the machine. The flywheel was visible. The governor was visible. The boiler was a drum with a fire under it and a gauge on its side, and it had been working correctly for every hour they had run it, and most people had stopped looking at it. Everyone's watching the wheel spin, Seo-rin said. Her voice was level in the way it got when she was being careful. But all of it, the speed, the work, the wonder, comes from this, a drum of iron holding back fire and pressure with nothing but rivets and our arithmetic. The engine governs its speed now. Nothing governs how hard a proud man will push this boiler when he's seen what one more turn of pressure can do. Tae-ho had come back from the forge. He stood beside her and put his hand on the nearest seam. Not the gesture of a man showing off his work, but the gesture of a man reminding himself what his work actually was. I proofed it cold to twice our working pressure, but proof is a number on a calm morning, Seo-rin. He did not take his hand off the seam. The danger was never the part we feared. It's the part we stop fearing once it's worked 100 times. Do-jin heard this from the doorway. He had been about to leave. He turned back and looked at the engine, the whole of it, from the fire door to the governor, from the boiler seam to the belt running up to the line shaft, and let it sit in him for a moment, the full weight of what they had built and what they had not yet built around it. Tireless, governed, and one drum of iron holding all of it together. He looked at the boiler gauge. The needle was exactly where it should be. Tomorrow we tell the whole crew, he said. He was talking to Seo-rin and Tae-ho, but he was also talking to himself, in the way he sometimes did when he needed to hear something said aloud to make it real. The engine has a governor. Our nerve doesn't. Mind the pressure like your life depends on it. He paused, because somebody's does. The engine chuffed in the quiet of the emptying shop. The balls turned. The needle held. Outside the stream ran low over its stones, indifferent now to whether the hammer fell or rested. Its long monopoly over the works ended without ceremony on an ordinary afternoon in the dry season.